I welcome back to those of you who have been here before. Those of you who haven't, welcome for the first time. I hope you got a programme and will come to our future lectures. We have, what are we on, 3? So we have 5 more after tonight. Tonight we're going to be hearing about a controversial topic, something that's always been controversial from the moment they came over, which is the black and tans on the auxiliaries. John is going to tell us about especially centred in Cork and especially centred in Cork City, about the attempts to repress the Irish Revolution, to repress the Irish independence movement. The black and tans have obviously been pilloried for many years, the sweepings of English jails and so forth. John is going to talk about that, the truth, the reality. A few words about John before we get going. John, you can tell from his accent, is originally from far west of here in San Francisco, but he's an adopted Cork man. Don't hold that against him. He is a specialist on Cork in the Irish Revolution and especially in the War of Independence. So, can you please welcome John Borgonovo?
Thanks for that kind introduction. I was warned to look out for Dublin treachery, so I'm glad I have my back to the wall. And I'm also, as you can tell from my surname, I'm Italian, of Italian extraction, so I talk with my hands. So you might want to. I'm glad we don't have anybody in the front row, so I might actually clip them. This talk is I give a version of this in Cork a couple years back, and I kind of cobbled it together with some other ideas I've been developing. So I might be a little bit jumping around because I'm kind of adapting it as we go along. So it's a bit of a work in progress. And as John said, this is kind of a controversial subject. The idea of reprisals, the idea of black and tans. I thought it was funny. I wrote a review of this new book on black and tans, and I pointed out that in the States, everybody thinks that black and tans is a really popular drink. And so on Paddy's Day, at all the Irish bars in the States, they serve you black and tans, which is Guinness in a lager, and they think that's really great. And Nike recently released a black and tan sneaker, tennis shoe for kind of hipsters, urban hipsters, until there was a big uproar from Irish Americans, so they withdrew it. Obviously, the marketing folks hadn't done much study, and we're not going to worry about those slides there because just a couple of photographs. But those chaps who are up there were kind of really embody this idea of the kind of adventurer black and tan who came over and really captured international imagination and drew a lot of attention to the War of Independence. And there are a whole variety of reasons why they showed up, where they were deployed, and also what they represented to different people. The big thing I've kind of argued in my last book, the Dynamics of War and Revolution, which looks at Cork City from 1916 to 1918, which I don't have books to sell you, unfortunately, because they're very heavy. But what I've argued is that you have to really contextualize the events of the War of Independence and the Civil War in the First World War experience. And keep in mind that what Britain told its people was that the reason they fought the war was for the liberation of the Belgian people, kind of a humanitarian intervention to protect little Belgium from German imperialism, from German brutality. And the idea of atrocities in Belgium, some of which were real, some of which were imagined, became very much part of the popular perception of events and one of the primary motivations for Britain making this tremendous ungodly sacrifice in the trenches of the First World War. So when you have the black and tans coming over and behaving in a very aggressive manner, often breaking the law, often looting, often burning, they basically walked into a propaganda dream for the Republican propagandists who were very skilled. The Republicans were able to basically carry over this idea of kind of whatever the word is, transform. There's a scientific expression I'm losing because I'm just off the bus. Basically, they were able to replace little Catholic oppressed Belgium with little Catholic oppressed Ireland, replace the rampaging German Huns and Prussian hordes with black and tans. and basically present their struggle as a war of national liberation and a war of emancipation from foreign invasion, which probably a more accurate analogy, which the British government constantly tried to make, was more of, this was similar to the American Civil War, with Ireland trying to break off from a union, the United Kingdom. And so it was an internal war rather than an external war of liberation. And that kind of struggle was played out in the pretty much international world opinion arena over the next few years, and it really had a decisive role in convincing the British government to come to some kind of terms, because they were getting such a black eye over this interpretation of the struggles here in Ireland. So anyway, that's kind of my background. I'll also just kind of point out that the burning of Cork City is remembered in Cork. It wasn't remembered really elsewhere until a documentary about 2007, 2006 was shown by RTE. I was assured that it had some of the highest ratings of a history program of its time, which people in Cork assume means that people in Dublin always want to see a bad story coming out of Cork, the city being burned. But before that, it had been, this whole episode had been kind of ignored. So what I'm going to try to do is try to tell you a bit of the story about the Black and Tans coming to Cork City, what happened. I'll try to contextualize it nationally, and keeping in mind that this story is in particular to Cork. Croke Park has its own version of this kind of events, but also other parts of the country would have experienced similar, very traumatic episodes in their local histories, relating to basically excesses taken by paramilitary police brought into the country to restore law and order. So, context. We are taught that the War of Independence started in January 1919 when the first Doyle met and Dan Breen decided to pop a couple of RIC men at Solahead Beg. That's normally how we teach it in the history books. But if you look at the actual levels of violence, the fatalities, the armed encounters, there very little happened in 1919 in terms of the military struggle. A lot was happening politically. Sinn Féin was kind of spreading its control, but even then Doyle Aaron wasn't really running. The Doyle courts weren't set up. There was very little actual activity on the ground. That started to change in January 1920, and the most aggressive parts of the Irish Republican Army around different parts of the country started taking action here in Dublin, our group around Michael Collins, but also down in Cork, places like Clare, places like Longford. But even then, basically, the real heavy stuff only broke out in the summer of 1920. So what's my numbers here? In the first 15 months, from January 1919 to May 1920, 3 members of the Crown Forces were shot by the IRA in Cork, killed or wounded. Over the next 15 months, 67 members of the Crown Forces were hurt or killed in the IRA attack. And that's actually Cork City. So the really heavy violence occurred in a much shorter period than we probably appreciate, probably about a year. So from the autumn of 1920 all the way to the summer of 1921. And if you look at the fatality figures and armed attacks in 1921, they keep going up. It's getting busier and busier all around the country. Now, in terms of the nature of the struggle, it was very uneven. There were counties where hardly a shot was fired. There were counties that were really busy early and then got quiet. There were counties that were quiet early and got busy later. Mayo, there was hardly a shot fired, and all of a sudden Mayo kind of burst into flames in May 1921. Donegal had been active in 1920, but then wasn't active in 1921. Limerick had been very active in 1919, very early before, and then they kind of collapsed. Limerick City did at least. You had also places, when you think about the Civil War, two of the most dangerous places in the Civil War were Sligo and Wexford. Sligo and Wexford were two of the most inactive areas in the War of Independence for Republican activity. So the whole nature of the struggle was very uneven. The organization was organic. It was not top-down. Michael Collins did not win the War of Independence. There was very little interaction between headquarters here in Dublin and the individual units around the country. It was very much up to local initiative. Operations, practices, all that stuff was invented kind of on the fly. The whole thing, as I said, I would argue that the whole guerrilla warfare was kind of made up as they went along, using kind of sound organizational methods. But there wasn't any kind of template they went off of. So anyway, so everything's kind of mixed up. By far the most violent county was Cork. There isn't a real easy explanation for that. There was always a strong advanced nationalist community, Republican community in Cork, kind of coming from the Gaelic League, from the National Revival. You saw similar kind of concentrations in urban Ireland, here in Dublin obviously, but also in Belfast. So you had a good kind of cadre of leaders in the city of Cork that kind of spread out. Cork also had this strange anomaly where it had its own political party to rival John Redmond's, the All for Ireland League, which was anti-Redmond, which was much more associated with advanced nationalists, but then it was also opposed to, it was much more conciliatory towards Unionists and Protestants. So a little weirdness there, typical Cork, I guess. They were also kind of resented centralization from the party in Dublin. So that was probably part of it as well. And then I would think a big thing was also that in 1916, Cork did not rise up. So its leadership was not beheaded, was not decapitated, as what happened here in Dublin and elsewhere, and its membership wasn't really arrested or harassed. So it maintained a very well-organized IRA, Irish volunteer organization, that preceded 1916 and then built on from there. So that's probably a whole bunch of different reasons. But anyway, it's exceptionally violent by any standard. More troops were killed there, more IRA members lost their lives there, more civilians were killed there, more civilians were killed by Crown forces there, more civilians were killed by IRA there, more troops were deployed there, more police were deployed there. It was the most violent part of the country by far, especially by per capita. That's also kind of why it's a lot of the historiography has looked at it, the whole myth of Tom Barry and the Flying Column. In terms of that activity, that kind of Flying Column activity, that stuff was exceptional rather than normal. Very few IRA members were killed in combat across the country. Most IRA members were killed while in custody of the police or the troops, were shot in their beds or killed when they were arrested. There were very few people actually killed fighting with guns in their hands, trench coats and rifles, having to go at an ambush. That was a rare kind of death. Most people were killed while they were being arrested, mostly deliberately. So that kind of method of action kind of led to a lot of tenseness. It also led to the importance of being able to identify potential British sources of information within communities, which led to a lot of kind of counterintelligence and execution of suspected informers. Anyway, but I digress. So when the first ambushes take place in early 1920 in the most active parts of the country, they sometimes were successful and they sometimes are not even successful. The barrack attacks were the first kind of step. The Irish volunteers were unarmed. The police were armed. They decided that they would arm themselves by seizing weapons from the police. A lot of those were held in barracks, and a number of barracks were attacked in kind of very elaborate, massive operations. Individual police were also disarmed in kind of various operations as well. Those operations, those barracks attacks especially, some of them were successful, a lot of them weren't, most of them weren't. It's hard to kind of storm into a defended location with big, huge steel shutters and sandbags. But psychologically and inadvertently, the IRA really struck something where basically the government decided to withdraw from all their vulnerable bases, places that they felt they couldn't defend and were at risk of being overrun, were abandoned. And about 2/3 of police barracks in the country were abandoned in about 3 or 4 months. Keep in mind that owing to the land war in the 1870s and 1880s, there were a lot of really tiny barracks, 4 or 5 man outposts, 3 or 4 guys on some farmer who had taken over evicted land. All that stuff was cleared out, and basically the police pulled back into the centers of population, the big towns. That basically opened up the whole countryside to the IRA, and the area was able to link up different units, was able to travel, and was basically able to bring Republican governance to the populace. So that was kind of a big step, and that wasn't even planned. That wasn't really their intention when they started attacking police and police barracks. That was just basically an unforeseen positive that came out of it. Also, I'll just mention very briefly that in the wake of that police withdrawal from the countryside, it created a policing vacuum in the country, and you saw an outbreak of agrarianism and land seizures and land grabbing, especially where you had congested districts that had experienced a lot of agrarian and agro in the recent ranch war, places that where land hadn't really quite been fully broken into small farms, especially up in Connacht. But you saw a total outbreak of land seizures and land grabbing, mainly evicted people who've been evicted 20, 30 years, going back into farms where they've been evicted and trying to reclaim their tenancy or reclaim ownership. And then in the cities, you also saw outbreaks of petty crime. Because again, the police weren't functioning and were mainly concentrated on political crime, and they also didn't like to patrol because they were being attacked. So you saw a lot of police just staying in their barracks, and a lot of ordinary crime was breaking out. So where I studied in Cork City, you had a whole rash of burglaries and some armed robberies going on as well. So it was in that context that Doyle Aaron set up the Republican courts and a Republican police force. It wasn't some kind of Arthur Griffith master strategy of creating a de jure state. That was part of it. That wasn't the primary motivation. The primary motivation was returning a level of governance to a place to prevent anarchy, to kind of fill this power vacuum that had emerged. And then also to demonstrate Republican capacity for self-government, which was kind of a core argument against independence amongst the British. So anyway, this is all kind of clipping along. And in that context also, this is where you start seeing massive resignations of the old RIC, the old Royal Irish Constabulary. Keep in mind that they're the only armed police in the United Kingdom. They're paramilitary, they live in barracks, they carry rifles. There's kind of a perception now that they were kind of the old Bobby, and there was some respect for them in certain communities. They'd also antagonized a whole lot of the rural population during the land war. And as I said, they were the only armed police in the UK. And in function, they were a lot closer to like the Italian Carabinieri or the French gendarmes or the Spanish Guardia Civil. Yeah. So they're carrying on. They're not just, their function is not purely to defeat crime. Crime is also political. So they're taking notes. They're operating as a political force. And as more pressure is put on them, as British official repression of Sinn Féin is undertaken, more increasingly they resign from the force, and you start seeing a demoralization of the force. What's interesting about it, again, which isn't really included much in the historiography, was a lot of this was labor union, trade unions oriented. They had no trade. They were trying to set up a union in the force at the time in early 1920. There'd been police strikes in London. The London Metropolitan Police had gone out on strike. So had the Liverpool Police in 1919. So the same things about war bonuses. The inflation had gotten big. Their pensions were I know it sounds crazy that people will get excited about this stuff. Their pensions were at risk. Their pensions were, because of wartime inflation, their pensions didn't have much purchasing power. There were conditions about working conditions that had gotten a lot worse owing to the militarization of the conflict. So their working conditions had gotten a lot worse. So a lot of this agitation, some of it was political, some of it was also socio-economic and related to trying to organize a union within the police. The end result is about a third of the police force resigned in the first 6 months of 1920.
which is massive. So the police seem to be unraveling. They are unraveling. There are much fewer of them going out. There are a lot of them in a lot of units. They're refusing to go out on patrol. They're refusing to arrest Republicans who they know. They're here in Dublin. There's very much a move against carrying weapons, against getting involved at all outside of the G division. So the policing is in a total crisis. And it's in this context, not to overword the context, in this environment that the government seeks reinforcements for the Royal Irish Constabulary. And they also wanted to bring in, because the RIC had been subject to physical attack and barracks had been attacked, they also wanted to bring in some ex-soldiers to kind of provide a little muscle, guys who had learned war fighting on the trenches. Put a few of those guys behind a few barrack windows and you might have a little bit of a better defense, a little more lively defense. So initially they were thinking of bringing over guys to just train the RIC in war fighting. But eventually the force was becoming so demoralized and losing so many members that they decided just to bring over reinforcements in general. And as you guys probably know, the first reinforcements that were brought over didn't have there weren't enough uniforms to go around, so they wore kind of a motley assortment of khaki and then also the bottle green uniforms of the Black and Tans, the Royal Irish Constabulary. One thing that's interesting about these first guys who came over, the ordinary constables, was they were actually physically a lot smaller than the old RIC. They were working class ex-soldiers mainly from England, but also from Scotland, a few from Wales, and they were mainly unskilled. They were almost entirely working class. The kind of the ordinary constables, and they were actually physically a lot smaller than the RIC, who had these kind of a strict height requirement. So I always think that maybe one of the reasons they didn't have enough uniforms was the pants didn't quite fit. But that's purely speculative on my part. And so they were brought over, and they were basically brought in as ordinary constables. It's a good job. There was huge unemployment in Britain at the time, up to 20 was going to go up to 25%. So ex-soldiers didn't have jobs. There was widespread economic distress in Britain, and this seemed like a good option. You come over, you're not going far from home, you're getting a good pay, you're getting a good pension, you're getting respectability. It's a step up in social class. You're becoming a policeman, and everything seems good. And then from the government standpoint, it's also taking care of part of helping dissipate this big unemployment crisis with the ex-soldier population in Britain. So it's a win-win, or so it seems. So that's the ordinary constables, and those are the guys we call the Black and Tans. The auxiliary cadets are the guys wearing the tam o' shanter kind of caps, and they're a different force. They're a separate division within the RIC, and kind of just the way they were organized. They were an elite within the RIC. They got much better pay. They were getting paid £1 a day, and they also had good allowances. And their membership was left to only ex-officers in the British forces, either the Navy, the Air Force, or the Army. And so they were an elite. And one of a police historian in Ireland, Jim Hurley, he believes that they were actually being organized as a new leadership cadre for a reorganized, kind of more militarized RIC, but then they weren't quite deployed that way because of basically the allowance of there was a crisis in terms of membership, in terms of drop of membership, and they had to just deploy them out as kind of ad hoc manner rather than waiting for a body of new constables to fall in underneath them. Regardless, they were given special status. They were given access to the best kind of weapons. They had machine guns. They had good lorries. They had a lot of them wore kind of hanging pistols. They looked like kind of something out of the Mexican Revolution sometimes. And one of the misconceptions about the auxiliaries, and actually the reason they were called cadets was because they were supposed to be in training for officer positions within the Royal Irish Constabulary as a district inspector. They're supposed to be basically training to be district inspectors, kind of the low rung of the officer class of the RIC. But in fact, they were basically deployed as an elite force to attack IRA hotspots. And they were organized into companies of about 100 members. They had their own kind of support, their own catering, their own pay, all that stuff. They were this own kind of separate autonomous division. So when the Irish public saw that they were ex-officers, they had a lot of experience with ex-officers. Ex-officers to them meant these guys who'd gone to Sandhurst. They were guys who were going to the racing at the Curragh, people who liked to fox hunt, guys who would go out to India and shoot a bunch of tigers, run up outrageous mess bills, members, pretty much maybe the less intelligent members of some of the gentry families, and the kind of traditional officer class of the British Army, very much related to the British aristocracy. That was when the Irish public saw officer, that's what officer meant to them. But those officers, that officer class was pretty much wiped out in the first year of the First World War. Took tremendous casualties. And they were replaced by a less elite class, mainly middle class, called temporary gentlemen, people who were given temporary commissions in these old regiments. These are the guys who came over as the auxiliary cadets. Not necessarily somebody who has a title, but somebody who all of a sudden being an officer in the British Army is a step up in terms of status, in terms of prestige, in terms of pay. And they want to retain that distinction. And they're also drawn by, again, good pay, pound a day is good money, and possible pension. And just as a lot of these guys would also be drawn into colonial policing and places around the empire and going out to India and going out to Burma. So this was seen as kind of a status. But the whole thing was that to the Irish public, these were the bravest of the brave, the elite of British society, the officer class. And when they behaved badly as they did all across the country, it was seen as just shocking. It was, and that caused a lot of anger and just a lot of disbelief that these guys who were supposed to be such an elevated position would behave in such an abject manner. So, geez, that's a long introduction. In terms of the way this played out in Cork was the black and tan kind of reinforcements came in drippings and drabs, the ordinary constables, and they were kind of spread out along a lot of individual stations. And it's hard to even delineate them and differentiate them from the ordinary old RIC, who were almost exclusively Irish, who were mainly Catholic. So they're kind of a mixed bag, and historians haven't really figured out who was acting where and how ordinary stations were acting. It's a lot easier to track the auxiliary cadets because they were in these distinct companies, and they were sent out. They also wore these very distinct uniforms, so everybody knew who they were. They spoke with English accents, and they were wearing funny, what do you call it, tam o'shanter? What's the name of the cap? Yeah. So everybody knows who they are. One thing also I'll just point out is there's also been a lot of talk about how a lot of the Irish were black and tans. The numbers about Irish percentage of black and tans, it's about 10%. That's what historians and policing figure. So it's not very high. It's actually quite low. We also don't know. We can't break that out into Ulster Unionists or Southern Unionists or Southern Nationalists or Northern Nationalists. We can't break it out even further. So it's not clear how many people were actually Southern Nationalists were joining. I would say very, very few. Keep in mind that this expansion, so you're talking about maybe 9,000, 10,000 police reinforcements were brought over from Britain. This took place at a time when you had about 150,000 ex-soldiers in Ireland with very high unemployment, and very few of them joined this new force, even though it would have been extremely tempting for them to do so in terms of money, in terms of kind of going back to soldiering. So Some of them ended up joining the British Army, but because the government didn't trust Irish regiments, they weren't deployed in Ireland. So most of the Irish regiments were deployed elsewhere. They weren't deployed in Ireland during these troubles because they basically couldn't be relied on. So anyway, there you go. So the auxiliary cadets pop up in Cork. It's not quite clear when they show up. Probably October, November of that period. That's when they started showing up in the public record, although police records don't put them there until December. But that's probably reflective of how ad hoc this was. This was a total crisis where Dublin Castle was basically, like the IRA, kind of making it up as they went along. And they were also demoralized and just trying to respond to events very rapidly. So already Cork at that stage was under military curfew. And it had gone under military curfew after a strange episode when a ex-soldier was killed walking through the city center by a British Army curfew or a British Army patrol out at night, and it was some kind of fist fight, and the curfew patrol went in and they bayoneted this ex-soldier who was probably drunk, he was going with the chipper after going to some prize fights, and after this, they had a massive funeral for him. About 5,000 ex-soldiers marched, carried his coffin through the city at a big demonstration. They were very angry about this guy being killed. No prosecution of the soldier who had done it. And actually one of his pallbearers was the head of the Bandon Ex-Soldiers Federation, which was Tom Barry. This was before Kilmichael. This was only been about 2 or 3 months before Kilmichael. So just kind of explaining how rapidly the political situation was evolving. After that funeral, the ex-soldiers ended up attacking active duty soldiers off duty in Cork City, and they brawled in the streets. That night, or the night of the first funeral, a divisional commissioner of police was assassinated in the Cork Conservative Club, a guy called Divisional Commissioner Gerald Smith. The next day, when these fights broke out between soldiers and ex-soldiers being angry at the soldiers for their part in the killing of one of their comrades, the British Army sent out armored cars into the city, and they opened up with machine guns, and they wounded about 25 people, and they shot dead 2 people, and they wounded about 25. So they basically just opened up on big crowds of civilians. And again, we don't talk about this episode. This episode is totally unknown. It's not really even known in Cork. It's not dissimilar at all from what happened in Croke Park. And it's as reckless as what happened in Croke Park. And the similarity is it happened right after a very high-profile assassination of a police official. So it seems like it was a reprisal. But as is the case with a lot of this stuff, it's very hard to pin down what was being authorized, what wasn't being authorized. So also, as a punishment to the whole community, Cork City was put under a dusk to dawn curfew. And that curfew was explained that when things calmed down, they would reduce the curfew. But it was basically punishing the entire community. So it was a form of collective punishment. And you see that around the country. Curfews were brought in most of the towns and counties that had high IRA activity. And this was not necessarily seen as a way of regaining control. It was a way of punishing the community economically and socially. And that was, and if you read what British generals and what martial law figures and officials are saying, that's how they're explaining it. They're explaining that if you turn your back and do no longer support the Republican movement, this kind of onerous curfew will be lifted. And when you have stuff like if a policeman was shot, they'd lower the curfew an hour or two. So in Cork, it was down to like 4 or 5, maybe 5 o'clock in June of 1921. When it's getting dark at 11. And you see the similar things going on elsewhere. You also see blockades of certain towns. The most notorious one was Tralee. Tralee was basically blockaded by British troops for about 2 weeks, and they didn't allow supplies to get in. And basically, none of all the shops that had shut down. There was food shortages. That produced a whole backlash of bad publicity, and that was stopped. But you also see stuff like if there was an ambush in a town, their train service might be suspended for 2 weeks, and that basically paralyzes all trade. So this idea of collective punishment, was embraced. It was used very effectively in parts of the empire. It had been used against the Boers. It was an idea of making a whole community to pay for the activities of a few malcontents, as the British government would have seen it. If you read about British or about counterinsurgency practice today, which unfortunately my government has a lot of familiarity with, that's pretty much the worst possible outcome. The worst possible policy you can do is by punishing the entire community. Because the only thing that does is it antagonize the population and drive them towards the insurgents, the rebels. And it also diminishes your own legitimacy. So this was a totally counterproductive policy, these kind of official and semi-official reprisals. Also in Cork at the same time, so all that would have been official reprisals. But then you also have unofficial reprisals. Official reprisals that are taking place where people aren't quite sure whether these are being approved by the High Command or not. So as violence accelerated and escalated in Cork City in the fall of 1920, you start seeing the publication of notices in newspapers. So this is one. This appeared in the daily newspapers. I think it also was put up as posters around the city. And it read, "If in the future any members of His Majesty's forces be murdered, 2 members of the Sinn Féin party in the county of Cork will be killed, and in the event of a member of the Sinn Féin party not being available, 3 sympathizers will be killed. This will apply equally to the laity and clergy of all denominations. In the event of a member of His Majesty's forces being wounded or an attempt being made to wound him, 1 member of the Sinn Féin party will be killed, or if a member of Sinn Féin is not available, 2 sympathizers will be killed. I have the honor to describe myself here truly, the Assistant Secretary, Anti-Sinn Féin Society, Cork Circle." So this was police putting in warnings in the daily newspapers. Another one, on the 21st of November, a police detective was kidnapped, and then this little line appeared in the daily newspapers. "If Constable Ryan is not returned within 24 hours, citizens of Cork beware of the consequences. Signed, his comrades." Here's another one. "If Mr. Downey is not returned to his home within 56 hours, Cork citizens prepare, especially Sinn Féiners. Signed, Black and Tans." Important notice. "We, the undersigned, do now give the male sex of Cork City notice, which must be adhered to forthwith, that any person of said sex who is found to be loitering on street corners or on any pathways without reasonable excuse while he should be there, or any man or boy found to be standing or walking with one or both of his hands in his pockets, will, if he does not adhere to this order, suffer the consequences which no doubt will ensue. Signed, Secretary, Death or Victory League. God save the King." You have, this is not distinct to Cork. This was happening in other hotspots around the country. So you have agents of the Crown in uniform, policemen threatening murder and arson of the citizens, and publicly and without really any fear. And I think what I want to kind of convey is the idea that this was happening in broad daylight, that everybody knew this was happening. So when we talk about what was being authorized and what wasn't being authorized, it's, the dog in the street knew what was happening. International journalists knew what was happening. This was not a secret. And I will say, in fairness to the British establishment, the way this was I'll kind of explain, one of the reasons this didn't get completely out of hand was you had British journalists coming over here, international journalists too, a lot from France, a few from Italy, from the States, but primarily British journalists coming over here and touring and explaining to British newspaper readers what was happening here. And basically every time an official explanation was given for, accidental burnings of something or a factory being burned by Sinn Féiners, intrepid and brave journalists were going out and reporting what they saw, and oftentimes at grave risk to their body, and some of them were threatened with death. And so in that circumstance, the Fifth Estate did its job and did it well. So anyway, this is all kind of escalating in the autumn of 1920. And You have the deployment of auxiliary cadets and black and tans who seem to have been given a green light to basically do what they need to do to restore order. Now, there's a kind of an ongoing debate about how far up the chain of command this went. There's a recent book called The Black and Tans by a Canadian historian called David Leeson. It's a good book. It's very detailed and offers a lot of kind of good demographic information about the Tans. But he basically argues that this was kind of spontaneous. There was the response of guys being stressed and being attacked and kind of lashing out. Well, to me, what I would argue is this seems to be that it's almost certain that this was being directed at the highest levels of government. You see the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George's personal police advisor, General Hugh Tudor, who ends up becoming head of the RIC. He travels around different police stations in the summer and autumn of 1920 and basically kind of bucking up the police, telling them that they'll be backed up, telling them that if basically they won't get in trouble for shooting anybody. And then there are a number of different records in Dublin Castle and the British cabinet where the most senior members of the government believe that there's a counter-assassination policy being undertaken. They think the police are shooting 2 Sinn Féiners for every 1 policeman being killed. That's not happening, mainly from poor execution, not from a lack of trying. So counter-assassination was definitely, there's very good documentation that counter-assassination was being encouraged, was being directed. But then this property stuff, this collective punishment, there was a certain level of it was being officially directed, and you'd have official reprisals later on where houses would get blown up by soldiers. They'd basically come up with a form and hand somebody a form and then explain to them they had 15 minutes to get out, vacate the premises, and their whole house would be blown up by grenades or set afire. You had about 100 houses destroyed that way in Cork in 1921. You also had factories and creameries burnt. But then you also had these crazy occasions where police go amok and they burn houses, they burn factories. Balbriggan's probably the best known example. It's close to Dublin. That was really the first one of these big ones that happened. You also had out in Clare, you had a similar one where about 5 towns were hit. But it's the same thing kind of all over the country. It's not confined to a certain locale. And in some places it seems to be effective. In Galway basically doesn't really attack police after a policeman's killed and they burn down some houses and kind of run amok for a couple of nights, smash up the newspaper. So this is all this is happening again in a pretty abbreviated period of time. Really the autumn of 1920, really when this stuff's getting out of hand. So the other thing it's kind of doesn't look good for the government is Dublin Castle started its own police newspaper called the Weekly Summary. It was a propaganda exercise for police. It was issued every week to every police barracks in the country. And basically it was, I always cry when I read about the Weekly Standard, Weekly Summary. But it was made up of newspaper clippings from around the world, international press, basically defending the police and condemning the Republicans. And in the beginning of October 1920, the Weekly Summary started running stories that defended unofficial reprisals. So like it quoted the British Army commander Macready, who claimed that when soldiers saw their commanding officer killed, quote, "It's human nature that they feel they ought to avenge his death." He also blamed reprisals on the IRA and the broken system of justice, which caused the Crown forces to take law into their own hands. So the following week, another article said that reprisals are inevitable in the circumstances, that no body of men can be expected to stand by and see their comrades murdered in cold blood. And then I mentioned one of these Anti-Sinn Féin Society notices that appeared in the Cork newspapers. That was reprinted in the Weekly Standard with no comment, as was one from Lisburn, which read, "Lisburn will claim not an eye for an eye, but 3 or more lives for either the murder or injury to any local member of the RIC or auxiliary force." So these warnings were appearing in the official police newspaper without comment, obviously condoning the said message. November 12th, headline was Sinn Féin reaps the whirlwind, talking about death threats against Lord Mayors, public threats to nationalists in Down and Derry and Wexford. So all this stuff is taking place. So there is a debate going on in the British cabinet about whether they should introduce martial law to Ireland. The government's argument has been this is an issue of crime, that basically criminal element and the Republican terrorists are cowing the entire country, that it's only a few bad apples, and that these crime murderers will be brought to justice. The government did not want to introduce military law. It didn't really have any military reinforcements, but also it would have been seen as a defeat of its policy up to now. But the escalation of unofficial reprisals basically forced the Crown Force's hands, and this really is embodied by what happens in Cork. So in Cork, over in the last 2 weeks of November, members of the police at night, because remember there's no curfew at night, or there's curfew so no one's in the streets, but witnesses start seeing policemen going in and burning down meeting halls all across the city. Pretty much every night a different hall was attacked. These were mainly used by Sinn Féin, but also the ITDWU hall was hit. So in 2 weeks, 8 meeting halls were burned, and 2 homes and 7 shops. So that's 2 weeks. That's basically every night there was arson attacks somewhere in the city. 17 separate buildings burned down. This is before the burning of the city by the Black and Tans. And there was little doubt as to who was doing this. As I said, most of the time police were identified. At 3 of the blazes, police actually fired on the fire brigade, and twice they cut their hoses. So they also tried to set fire to City Hall about 3 different times. And after the 3rd time, the fire brigade kept a detachment in City Hall 24 hours a day because they knew it was going to be burned by the Crown Forces, which it was eventually, the burning of the city in December. But again, this is not only unique to Cork, this is happening elsewhere. It's happening in a lot of the big towns, and basically any major population area close to an ambush. Similar things are happening. And you also have, at this time, the Kilmichael ambush, where auxiliary cadets are defeated by West Cork flying column. You also see Bloody Sunday here, which is a very dramatic moment in terms of Dublin Castle, in terms of British officers, the creme de creme being shot down in their beds all across the city centre, which is supposed to be under the control of the Crown Forces. And the response is to go into Croke Park and open fire on a crowd, which to me is always, I'm always still amazed at how little resonance that episode carries with historians, because I think it's just the most remarkable thing. And yet we always talk about the assassinations of the suspected intelligence officers, and not the fact that a crowd was being fired on. It's remarkable. Anyway, that's my little divergence. So also during this period in Cork, members of the Crown Forces started committing crimes, property crimes. There were a number of payroll robberies and bank robberies, which seemed to have been committed by members of the auxiliary cadets. There were guys with English accents, cars. IRA might have been involved sometimes. I'm sure there was also some civilian kind of freebooters, opportunists, also taking advantage of the situation. But you also saw a lot of the jewelry shops in the city being hit and being targeted and being broken into, kind of systematically almost. And I see one of them one of the civilians who died was a Jewish woman, Sarah Madley, who who was living in her jewelry shop on Tuckey Street, and some disguised members of the Crown Forces climbed in, and she suffered a massive heart attack and died. And she's just as much of a victim as anybody else is as well. But this kind of idea of actual robbery did occur, and occurred on a pretty big scale in Cork City. You also had so a lot of this stuff is documented. The Republicans were doing a good job of documenting this stuff and taking depositions, so that's why you knew it was actually happening. 5 auxiliaries were basically searching pedestrians on the Grand Parade. They had a checkpoint, and they were just robbing people of anything they had in their pockets for hours. They actually robbed an off-duty policeman who complained. That's how they got in trouble. You had, as I said, a number of jewelry shops, but this is also just kind of the casual brutality is also. This is a testimony of Thomas Higgins of 12 Davis Street. I remember the night of 7th December. I was upstairs. I heard knocking on the door. I came down. My mother opened the door. I distinctly saw a man dressed as an auxiliary policeman enter the house. This man held me and searched me. While doing so, 2 others entered dressed the same and asked my mother for a candle. They went upstairs. The man searched me and asked me if I was a ringleader of Sinn Féin. I said no. He then asked me if I was a private in the IRA. I said no. He then asked me if I was involved in the Macroom ambush 2 days previously. I said I was never in Macroom. He then asked me if I knew Cromwell. I replied I'd heard of him. He then said this will be a second Cromwell. I should know who will govern Ireland. I replied I didn't know who governed it presently. He then showed me a grenade and asked me if I knew what that was. I said I did not know. And they ended up robbing about 50 pounds from their shop. So that kind of stuff is happening in relatively commonly. In terms of, there's also been a question, there's also kind of been an assumption that sexual violence didn't take place at the time. I'd actually be a little suspicious of that. I've come across a definite case of rape by black and tans who were trying to assassinate a Republican and got the wrong house. And another attempted case in the city. And I came across another attempted case in Ballincollig, but I've come across a number of cases. And what I think is, I don't see how this kind of transgressive behavior was happening without there being sexual violence or being a sexual element involved. I don't think it was as common, but I would be surprised if that wasn't the case. And then there also seems to have been some sexual violence in the Civil War as well, especially in Kenmare, the Kenmare incident in the Civil War, if any of you know that. I think that, as we see from the Ryan report, a lot of the sexual violence is not reported, and I suspect that was what was going on. But I obviously don't have proof. But just to kind of give you an idea of how this stuff is occurring, a deputation from the British Labour Party came over to look at conditions in Ireland, especially Cork, and they were standing outside of the GPO in Cork City, and that's normally where a bunch of kind of horse-drawn taxis hang out. And while this observation party of members of Parliament, there are about 6 MPs, while they're standing there, drunk auxiliaries came up and grabbed the whips off of the Jarvie drivers, and then they started whipping people going by. So they were just they were having fun, they were drunk, not that much fun. They also fired shots in the air and they hit an old lady in the arm. And that was in front of these guys who were observing, taking notes. So that kind of brazenness is very much part of what was going on. Were all black and tans like this? Was this some kind of crime wave? Were these guys the scum of British jails? The company that was in Cork was really bad. The guys, they ended up burning down a big portion of the Cork City Centre. They were then transferred to Devanway in West Cork, and within about a week, one member had killed Canon Magner, the local parish priest. 4 of them were also charged with robbing the Bank of Ireland, Devanway town, which they claimed was a drunken prank, and they were released. Another one was charged with planting evidence on a person and charging him £100 or planting a gun on him and having them write a £100 check to not be prosecuted for having a weapon, which was actually a capital offense at the time. So these guys seemed very bad. Their commanding officer, Colonel Latimer, was personally torturing IRA prisoners. They seemed like bad apples. And actually, but in terms of, there are also, when you have reports of burnings in Cork, there are also reports of members of the auxiliaries helping fight the fires, helping people pull out furniture, taking care of people who are wounded. So not everybody who's involved in this is some kind of, devil, some kind of lunatic. But what's clear is that there was a criminal element within the police who came over here. Might not have been a big criminal element, but there was a criminal element. Whether they were criminals before they came or whether they just became criminals when they're here, it's not clear. Some of these guys were also kind of adventurers. A lot of people had come over from the British intervention in Russia. But what's very obvious is that something was not right. There was very poor discipline, but this kind of level of activity was, as I said, not just confined to Cork. It was experienced in a whole lot of different places. And that's what led people to believe that these guys were convicts. That's what, it wasn't some kind of, dramatic thing. They saw people acting as like criminals or behaving in a criminal fashion, so they assumed that they were criminals before they came over. That's kind of where this whole myth of the scatterings of British jail came from. And then it was also encouraged by Sinn Féin propaganda as well, too. But, and also generally, the British Army generally behaved better than the police did in this circumstance. Like, guys in the British Army were prosecuted for property damage, for property looting, for assaults. And what's apparent there is the Army had its own disciplinary record and it was afraid of its morale collapsing. So it didn't like seeing its soldiers going out and doing this kind of looting and damaging and getting drunk and what have you. That's not to be, that being said, they still encouraged reprisals. They just wanted it controlled. And they wanted martial law so they could execute people officially rather than unofficially. So it's a different kind of perspective. But anyway, this all kind of culminated over the course of, by the first week of December. You also saw a whole lot of shootings of ordinary pedestrians, kind of just from the back, people from the back of lorries. So I have some count here. I can't really find it, but it was something like 10 pedestrians were shot dead in about 2.5 weeks, and about another 6 or 7 wounded by members of the Crown Forces. So they were just shooting into crowds or shooting from the back of lorries. And again, this is not distinct to Cork. Similar things were going on in other counties as well. It wasn't that common. It wasn't happening all the time. But just to give you an indication, in a lot of places in the country, if they heard a black and tan lorry going by, people would hit the dirt because they wouldn't want to be shot at. That kind of casual violence was endemic. And this is the reason why the black and tans have such a bad name in the country. And then just kind of what culminated, what happened in Cork City. There was an IRA ambush on a lorry full of auxiliary cadets. A grenade was thrown in. One was killed and about 10 were wounded. And then over the course of the next 4 or 5 hours, the auxiliary cadets, helped by some uniformed members of the British Army, moved into the center of the city. They were stationed up above what's now Collins Barracks. They came out in the center of the city and they started setting fire to buildings with grenades and incendiary devices. And they burned down 57 buildings and structures in the city center, and they damaged about 20 more. And they also looted about another dozen. So they looted all the jewelry shops were looted and broken into as the guys were walking out. And then also the other thing about looting was also going on kind of after the attack. A lot of these shops would get looted by ordinary people as well because there was endemic poverty as well. But there was repeated gunfire and grenades, and police members were walking out with kind of arms full of stuff. Keep in mind that at this stage, the city was under the command legally of the military governor, Major General Sir Peter Strickland. who was in charge of the 6th Division in Ireland, and he allowed this to happen. You know, troops did not go in and stop this. This went on for hours and hours and hours. The police also set fire to and burned down Cork City Hall, despite the efforts of the fire brigade that had been stationed inside there. And they also burned down the Carnegie Library across the street. Now, what's interesting about this was that these were located across the river about a quarter mile, maybe 300 or 400 meters from where the fires had burned, basically a big chunk of all over Plunkett Street. So these were across the river, a bit away. A map was released in some of the Tory newspapers, putting the city hall and library on the other side of the river next to the fires. And so they are, and the government was arguing that the Republicans had started the fires by throwing incendiary grenades. And so as part of a whole, dissembling exercise by the government, by the Irish Secretary, Sir Hamilton Greenwood, but people were not fooled. And just in terms of how this was perceived and how the Republicans spread this, going back to 1914 in Belgium, the big crime, the big, most notorious episode of the First World War, almost, or one of them, was the German sacking of what's the Belgian city? Yes, and the library, and the University Library there. This was used, this burning of a library and the burning of a city center was seen as kind of an act of barbarity, showed how awful they were. The Bryce Commission, the Bryce Report on German atrocities in Belgium, also emphasized the taking of hostages, the killing of mayors, the killing of city officials, and the burning of things like municipal buildings. By burning Cork City Hall and the Cork City Library, they basically replicated what the Germans had done. Not on anything like that scale, but that's how propagandists argued it and presented it. That they were doing the same thing. It wasn't the same, but it was perceived as being the same, or it was argued that it was the same. They also pointed to the police having assassinated Lord Mayor Thomas McCurtain, assassinating a Lord Mayor, shooting him as a reprisal. So they were able to make this argument that the British were doing to Ireland what the Germans had done to Belgium. And in the context of First World War, in the context of insanely effective British propaganda, that was a very powerful argument to make. And by embracing these reprisals, by allowing this to happen, by taking this kind of what seemed like an easy option for whatever reason, the British government gave the Republicans a tremendous propaganda victory. And that helped basically swing public opinion towards the Republican movement, towards the independence movement. It created international sympathy, and it gave Britain a black eye. And it eventually swung British domestic opinion against the government. And it was that domestic opinion that prevented Britain from doing to Ireland what they were doing at the time in Iraq or Egypt or India, burning, machine gunning villages, talking about contemplating using poison gas, burning down the whole country. They didn't do that here. And one of the reasons was because Republican propaganda was so effective and world opinion basically didn't have as high of a tolerance for doing to white Europeans what they were doing to black Africans and Asians with not much worry. And then just to kind of close out, this period, not just in Cork but elsewhere in the country, it didn't last that long. It was only about 3 or 4 months when the real insanity happened, when the real craziness happened, when guys were driving around back roads, drunk, shooting guns, when stuff was getting burned, all the looting, all that kind of stuff. That didn't last that long. Things got better to an extent. I'm not arguing that things were totally great afterwards, but levels of control were brought in. A little bit of discipline was brought in the police. Some of the worst units people were sent home, were court-martialed, were dismissed. You had a huge turnover in the auxiliary division amongst membership, guys being tossed out, and the British Army started asserting itself more. Things got somewhat better, but it didn't matter. This had already happened. Everybody knew about it. It had already created a story, and it already created a narrative that Ireland was defending itself from the hordes, these black and tan hordes. And for a generation afterwards, black and tans weren't just infamous here; they were infamous in Britain. Every time the British got into a counterinsurgency thing, they kept talking about black and tans. This totally scarred their psyche. The idea that their members, their people who were supposed to be defending law and order, could be basically breaking it with impunity, punishing communities, acting with complete lack of discipline and lack of regard. That seemed to have scarred them to a certain extent. And ultimately, although these communities suffered for a period of time and experienced tremendous suffering, 2,000 people lost their jobs in Cork City in one night. It took out the whole heart of the city center commercial district, and the Irish creamery movement was utterly destroyed. About 40 creameries were burned down. Think about all the jobs that lost rurally, and in a lot of areas, a lot of places, factories were burned. Commercially and economically, the country suffered. But by embracing these reprisals, the British government basically allowed the Irish independence movement a victory that it was decisive, I think, in the whole settlement that resulted. That's me for. Okay.
Okay, I'd like to thank John for that talk. Very interesting. I think you'll agree, talk. To sum up some of the points, I think I started some of them better than I have, but just to refresh, the black and tans were raised in mid-1920. They were drafted into the police. The auxiliaries were also raised at that time, but they were distinct corps. They came to Ireland, and for 3 or 4 months, John, they were more or less uncontrolled, and they really did rob and kill and burn as they are reputed to have done. I'd like to open the floor to questions. So the usual thing, if you want to speak, please raise your hand. I'll identify you, don't worry, everyone will get their question in. And one caveat I have, again, please ask your question as a question so that John can respond. Okay, so I'd like to open the floor to questions. Yeah, go ahead.
You talked earlier on about there being barrack attacks on all these isolated outposts, and after that they withdrew back into the cities. Say in Cork, were there actually attacks on the barracks in the city before this kind of cocooning?
Yeah, there were a couple. There was one that didn't go off, and there was another one on McCurtain Street was bombed, and they almost knocked down the building, but it kind of didn't quite go. Yeah, so there was one, and then a bunch of the barracks were burned. About 5 or 6 barracks were burned in the city, and when you read about these barracks, so these barracks were abandoned, and then they were set fire. A lot of this happened on Easter 1920, on the anniversary of the Rising, but they were also kind of happening periodically. And the descriptions of them are really interesting because it's kind of like a carnival atmosphere. So what would happen would be the IRA, the volunteers would come in, they'd set up barricades, they'd set fire to it, they'd be singing, inevitably a tricolor would be stuck on it, but sometimes there was reports of piano playing, and people would be sitting around kind of like a big bonfire, sitting around, and again, a couple thousand people coming to watch. The one on McCurtain Street that was torched, it was blown up, evacuated, then burned. A couple thousand people came down to watch it. That's like 4 blocks from Collins Barracks, and so the IRA had pickets out, kind of guys directing traffic. So this stuff was very public. And I think one night in 1920. About 300 barracks were burned around the country, and also courthouses as well. So these were all public events, and it's the same thing in the centers of town, kind of openly carried out almost. Yeah.
To come back to the Irish Republican Army in 1919, they did have the Democratic mandate. Mm-hmm. Because in 1918 it was the highest poll and the highest majority in the history of the state. So would you not agree that it was a rejection of the democratic consensus? I mean, not only by the British government, but the international community rejected the democratic consensus. Whereas today, the United Nations, they will send observers to places like South Africa to ensure that it's not divided or partitioned. So wouldn't you agree?
I would agree. And when you think about it, and this is kind of what I want to emphasize about 1919, they had a year, basically, if you believed in a use of nonviolence to achieve independence. So they went to Paris peace talks. They were trying to mobilize the American government to try to leverage and try to pressure the British government. They went about in a nonviolent fashion achieving independence. At a time when also, keep in mind that new states were given, so there was newly independent Finland, newly independent Poland, newly independent Yugoslavia, newly independent Czechoslovakia. All those new states were emerging in the Mideast, although under colonial control. But so the international new states were being created all around the world. So there was a year where basically people thought that the Republican movement might deliver independence non-violently. And people within the Republican movement were arguing that they could deliver this non-violently, and it didn't happen. So it was only after that year that you start seeing basically the impatience of the Irish Republican Army. But at the same time, the Irish Republican Army these elements weren't necessarily, the Doyle Aaron didn't take responsibility for the IRA until 1921. So they were supporting this, but not necessarily legally supporting. So it was ambiguous. The independence movement was committed to violence probably by late 1920. Up to then, it was still individual units kind of acting on their own to some extent. Some extent, it was being centralized, it was being directed, but it's a bit ambiguous. The whole thing's ambiguous. But I do agree to you that with your point that there was a democratic mandate for independence. And nonviolent means we're not achieving that independence.
There's a question down the back there.
Yeah, the Tom Barry's famous flying column, were their actions retaliatory, or would they have been, vice versa, or was it a bit of both?
So would they retaliate? Who was retaliating against who?
Was the flying column's actions like a reaction, or would it be?
So you know what's interesting with the flying columns? Again, I go back to this idea of it being kind of unplanned and kind of organic. There was a crackdown in the summer of 1920. So the TANs had come over, the British Army also kind of reinforced, and they started arresting people. When people were arrested, or people started getting arrested, people stopped staying in their houses, they went on the run. So the most active folks, the Republicans, especially in the IRA, went on the run. They left. For a lot of people, being on the run just meant you didn't sleep at home. It meant you might sleep in your neighbor's house. A lot of people didn't give up their jobs. But for some people, they gave up their jobs and were full-time fugitives. And they started traveling together and kind of staying in the same locations. And then they started, if there was a little ambush being planned, they'd join in. And they started training, and people started seeing kind of in different parts of the country, East Limerick and Cork, Tipperary, people started seeing that you could actually use these guys and train them and then kind of use them as an elite and kind of bring them in. So it was more of a response to them being fugitives. And then they decided to train these guys. And then keep in mind also, the IRA they were almost entirely unarmed. So the entire country in 1921, the IRA had 3,000 rifles. In County Cork, which had the biggest flying columns, the most active area, they had about 500 rifles. Most of the rifles had about 20 or 30 rounds of ammunition. So basically what they would do is they'd concentrate all the rifles in a little column, and then they'd go out and attack. So it was real kind of, but it was adapting to the circumstances on the ground.
There's a question in the front here.
Yes, the question is, would you agree? But after that, it gets back to the point you were making about sexual violence.
Yeah.
I also believe, with all the breakdown in discipline and what have you, that the one item of violence that couldn't possibly have been absent was sexual violence. But I think it was because there was a shame in reporting
Yes.
it. And you mentioned in the Civil War the Kenmare case. The Kenmare case is instructive because that was an assault on the daughters of a Cumbernauld doctor by his own side, by the troops. And the Free State soldiers who were charged with it were accused of stripping the girls and flogging them, not with sexual assault. And I think there would have been a reluctance on the part of the family, the identifiable family.
I saw a document where they mentioned rape.
Did it?
Yeah.
Well, because then the word where I did see the word rape being used was in Ernie O'Malley's interviews. These men will talk to me,
Yeah.
Gary, and Bill Bailey uses the word
Yeah.
rape, and he was a free-state soldier.
Yeah, Harrington. What the
Harrington was
papers.
accused of it. Harrington was going out with the girl, and he'd already exposed Ballyseedy, so they had it in for him
Right.
from his own side. So I think,
And that was the guy implicated was a general, Free State General.
yeah, Paddy O'Daly.
Paddy O'Daly, yeah, head of the squad.
Yeah. So would you agree then that perhaps you may find cases, but perhaps you're more likely to find them from the ranks of the British Army itself saying this happened, rather than a victim losing anonymity and saying,
Yeah.
I was
There's also a case where a tan was shot dead by a British officer he walked in on a rape. I think it was up in Tipperary somewhere up there. It wasn't in Cork anyway. Right, that's how I define stuff. But yeah, that's what I agree. And you're right, that's a really good example. That case, there was a middle class pro-treaty family, and there were 2 daughters, and yeah, but the shame of it, sure. That's what I think. And again, you don't get this level of transgressive violence. And I'll tell you another one. One of a person I know, her oral tradition in her family was that her grandfather was raped as a prisoner. That's an odd oral history to have in a family, and some of this stuff is kind of sexualized too. Guys naked, getting beaten around, and all kinds of stuff. So that level of transgressive violence, I think people, and also keep in mind also the shame of mental illness and the shame of not just sexual illness but also hysteria and all that stuff. So I think there's a whole. That's why the Ernie O'Malley stuff is so interesting, because a lot of that's coming out, and kind of the torture as well.
Yeah, there's a question in the back. I want to make a comment there myself. Just, I was looking at the War of Independence a little bit up in Leitrim, Cavan, Monaghan, which is much less violent than Cork.
Yeah.
You're talking about 500 killed in Cork, County Cork, and you're talking about in 3 or 4 counties about 150 killed. But exactly the same thing is going on in terms of the auxiliaries are breaking into people's houses and they're actually robbing them. People apply for compensation the following year in 1922. And they're applying for compensation for not only for beatings and things like that, and abuse, which again may or may not be sexual, it may just be women hit, but exactly the same stuff in terms of absolute ill discipline. So it's certainly not just in Cork.
Yeah.
Question in the back there.
After the boarding and the sacking of the main city, Cork, there was speculation down there that the detachment of black and tans involved in this were moved out the next couple of days.
They were.
And they were moved to different counties.
They were moved to Manly.
Yeah, but outside Cork as well. And they used to carry, from what I've been told, they had trophies where they used to put.
I've never. So that's a popular story. Yeah, they were supposed to have been going around with burnt corks,
Correct.
Because they burned cork. I've never actually traced that to. It's a great story.
That's my question to you.
Yeah, but they were transferred to Manway, and then, as I said, like a week later, 5 of them were done up in this bank robbery where they went in and robbed the Bank of Ireland, but they'd been drinking with the bank manager, who recognized them and said, like, Harry, what are you doing? And they were like, they walked out and they pretended it was a big joke, but those guys were ultimately dismissed. But yes, I've never been able to track that down. And there's a lot of that kind of oral history. The other one from Cork, I mentioned this guy, Divisional Commissioner Smith, who was assassinated and kind of triggered a bunch of responses. He had been involved in this thing called the Listowel Mutiny, where old RIC men had resented him telling them they could shoot anybody they wanted, and he told them to shoot Sinn Féiners on sight. So when he was assassinated, it was said that the IRA guy came up and said, "Your orders were to shoot on sight. You're in my sight now." Plugged him away. But again, I've never seen, that's a great story after the fact, and you'd have to have a lot of wherewithal to kind of, you'd have your line before you run in and shoot the guy, and the testimony doesn't have it, but that's a kind of real common thing. You see it repeated over and over again in the oral history, or the testimony, so it's weird how those stories just stay out. But my theory is always, if it sounds too good to be true, very often it is.
I think we've time for one final question. Yeah, this gentleman over here.
Coming back to Martin Corey, that gentleman at the top there, he was on that programme himself,
Yeah.
indicating the motives.
Yeah.
there were people there, contemporaries, who were burying these bodies, and who were fed up with burying so many bodies every day after day or night after night, that they said, we're not burying anymore. If you kill anyone else, you can bury them yourself. You seem to dismiss that.
So the next statement that the program didn't lead on was a statement from Martin Corey where he describes being in a barn, the same time being on the run, and an enormous black beast, the size of a black suckling calf, levitated, moved out of the barn, and leapt from the roadway onto a pillar 50 yards away, and it disappeared. And he had his hand on the gun, but his friend said, "Martin, don't shoot him." And we had no idea what it was. That's the exact next passage after that description. Also, the program did not, when he talked about killing 60 people, people said, 60? Really 60? And he said, well, of course it's 60. Earlier in the interview, he says 30. Then it goes to 37, the next sentence. And IRA pension, apparently, which I haven't seen, hasn't been released, he claims 27. He's all over the shop. I've done a lot of work on this. I can identify about 15 people. Maybe there were 20. There's no way this went on the scale. That I could say maybe there's people I have no idea about. But if they were, nobody looked for them. Nobody was asking questions. There's not that number of people who disappeared.
I mean, there were about, I think you can correct me, but 60 to 70 known civilians killed as informers in County Cork.
Right.
I think it's the recorded number.
Right. And so he's saying, and that's people we have bodies, and you also have people so I've identified people who were missing who I think some of them were buried down there somewhere. I can name about 7 or 8 civilians who went missing. You normally didn't want to go to the trouble of disappearing people because you might get intercepted, you might get stopped. What you try to do is you try to shoot them and then also leave them as a warning. That's generally what they do. So this idea of going down and it's bad. Anyway, so I'm very dismissive. I'm very dismissive of it.
So you have to disappear into the 70s.
Yeah, that's the 70s.
Witness the Jerry
And right, exactly. And how many? And by the way, how many people was that over 20 years?
Too many.
What, a dozen? 15?
Too many.
So they're talking about 60. That was in Northern Ireland, and I don't actually know the numbers, but I think it's something like that. Yeah. Something like 20, right? This program was claiming 60, and that's fine. And by the way, I'm not saying that that's great. I mean, that's not great, but it's if that's awful and it's awful to disappear, that's fine. That's not what we're talking about.
I know.
And the Jigger Halpin couldn't find them.
What's that?
The Jigger Halpin couldn't find them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I'd like to ask, this All for Irish League, who were they? What happened?
That's a long story.
Great story.
I'm afraid.
William O'Brien and some they had some agrarian radicals, they had some urban nationalists, they had some working class support, but then they also they were they recruited for the war effort and they kind of broke apart. But Tim Healy was also involved, and Tim Healy's outfit, but he was more right wing. But O'Brien was they were almost proto-Republican, but not quite.
And the Hayes and Collins's families were members of it.
A lot of the Republicans down there were.
And Canon Sheen wrote the manifesto for it.
Yeah. So
they've been absorbed into Sinn Féin.
They went over to Sinn Féin, but their leadership was dumped. So the rank and file joined Sinn Féin, and a lot of the Republicans would have been All for Ireland League.
I'm afraid I have to jump in there. I'm sorry, I'm afraid now we're about to get thrown out. I'm really sorry. We're about to get thrown out and say that now. I'd like to thank John again.